Hello, and welcome to Storytime with Mr. Laws. Today we're reading Wayside School Gets a Little Stranger by Lewis Sacker. Chapter 9. Something Different About Mrs. Jules. The children returned from Christmas holiday. On each desk were 2 knitting needles and a hunk of yarn. Today we're going to learn how to knit, said Mrs. Jules. She showed the class how it was done. See, you stick this needle through here, then wrap this around this like this, stick this through this, pull this like this, and then you stick this here. Any questions? Everyone stared at her. Good, said Mrs. Jules. I want everybody to make socks. Okay, get started. Damien looked at his knitting needles. He didn't have a clue. He looked back at Mrs. Jules. Now, more than ever, he was sure she was somehow different. She was sitting at her desk, knitting and eating bolognios. Damien couldn't remember Mrs. Jules ever eating a bologno before. A bologno was an Oreo cookie, except instead of the white part, there was a round hunk of bologna. Miss Mush invented them. Hey, Mac, whispered Damien. Does Mrs. Jules seem different to you? Yeah, she's fat, said Mac. That is not a nice thing to say, said Damien. Well, I didn't say it to Mrs. Jules, said Mac. I didn't go, hey, Mrs. Jules, you're fat. Mrs. Jules cleared her throat as she stood up. She walked around the room. Very nice, DJ, she said. You're doing fine, Rondi. She stopped at Joe's desk. Oh, Joe, she gushed. Look, everybody, I want you to see Joe's sock. She held it up. Isn't it the most beautiful sock you ever saw? It was a great sock. Everybody oohed and ahed. Joe was as surprised as anyone. He didn't know he knew how to make socks, but the boy was born to knit. Mrs. Jules started to cry. I love this sock, she sobbed. Uh-oh, said Kathy. I think she's finally flipped out. I love you, Kathy, said Mrs. Jules. She looked around the room. I love all of you. She put her hand on Kathy's desk. I love this desk, she said. I love the blackboard. I love the clock on the wall. There was a ruler on the floor. Mrs. Jules picked it up. I love this ruler, she declared. Hey, that's mine, said Dana. But, that's okay, Mrs. Jules. You can have it. I don't want your ruler, Dana, said Mrs. Jules, handing it to her. Oh, do you want my pair of scissors? Offered Cherie. Don't give her anything sharp, warned Kathy. Mrs. Jules wiped away her tears and smiled at the class. I'm going to miss you all very much, she said. Are you going away? Asked Damien. Yeah, to the loony bin, whispered Kathy. Are you sick? Asked Eric Ovens. No, I'm not sick, said Mrs. Jules. In fact, I'm better than I've ever been. She beamed. I'm going to have a baby. Everyone gasped. Damien couldn't believe it. He was so happy he jumped out of his seat and hugged Mrs. Jules. She was soon surrounded by all her students, even Kathy wanting to hug her. Today is my last day here, Mrs. Jules told her students. My doctor doesn't want me walking up and down 30 flights of stairs every day. I wasn't even supposed to come today, but I just had to say goodbye. I thought you were getting fat, said Mac, but I didn't want to say anything. Thank you, Mac, said Mrs. Jules. You're very considerate. Can I touch your stomach? Asked Stephen. Mrs. Jules laughed. Sure, she said. The children took turns touching her stomach. What are you going to name your baby? Asked Alison. I don't know yet, said Mrs. Jules. What do you think? Well, if she's a girl, said Alison, I think you should name her Rainbow Sunshine. That's a nice name, said Mrs. Jules. And if he's a boy? Buckethead, said Alison. She didn't like boys. No, if he's a boy, you should name him Jet Rocket, said Jo. Jet Rocket Jules, mused Mrs. Jules. That has a nice ring to it. And what if she's a girl? Spotty Face, said Jo. Mrs. Jules laughed. So, let me get this straight, she said. If he's a boy, I'll name him Buckethead. Right, said Alison and Rondi. And if she's a girl, I'll name her Spotty Face. Right, said Jo and John. Damien laughed. He knew Mrs. Jules was only joking. At least, he hoped she was. Terence placed his palm flat against Mrs. Jules's stomach. Hey, he exclaimed, the dude kicked me. Suddenly, Damien felt very sad. He was going to miss her a lot. He wiped a tear from his eye. It's unfair, he shouted. We finally come back to Wayside School after being gone for so long, and now you're leaving us. I have to, said Mrs. Jules. I know, whined Damien. You have to make sure that you and your baby are healthy, but it still isn't fair. Well, I think you'll like your substitute teacher, said Mrs. Jules. I spoke to him over the holiday. He seems like a very nice man. A man? Asked Damien. Cool. They all thought it was pretty neat to have a man teacher. Yes, said Mrs. Jules. His name is Mr. Gorf. Chapter 10. Mr. Gorf. Mr. Gorf, muttered Joy as she walked down the stairs to playtime. Did she say Mr. Gorf? Maricia nodded. Leslie caught up to them. Did she say Mr. Gorf? I think so, said Maricia. Do you think... Leslie asked. I don't know, said Maricia. I hope not, said Joy. Before Mrs. Jules ever came to Wayside School, the children had had a teacher named Mrs. Gorf. She wasn't very nice. Even Myron was worried, and Myron had never got in trouble in his whole life. Well, Mr. Gorf might be a good teacher, said Eric Bacon. Just because he has the same last name as Mrs. Gorf doesn't mean he'll be horrible. That's right, said Eric Ovens. People with the same name can be different. I agree, said Eric Fry. There are probably lots of people named Gorf, Damien said hopefully. I bet if you looked in the phone book, you'd find 10 whole pages of Gorfs. Well, I don't know about you, but I'm not coming to school tomorrow, said Joy. Me neither, Maricia agreed. But the next morning, their parents made them all go to school. Everyone arrived on time. Nobody dared to be late. But there was no teacher. Dee Dee sat down next to Myron. Is he here? She whispered. Shh, whispered Myron. He folded his hands on his desk and stared straight ahead. One by one, the children entered the classroom and quietly sat down at their desks. They couldn't take any chances. Mr. Gorf might walk through the door any moment. Or maybe he was already there, hiding in the coat cupboard, just waiting for someone to do something wrong. I didn't want to come today, whispered Calvin, but my parents made me. Shh, said Bebe. He might hear you. Mr. Kidswatter's voice came over the PA system. Good morning, boys and girls. Good morning, Mr. Kidswatter, the children all answered together, like good little boys and girls. They listened attentively to their principal. Then, when Mr. Kidswatter was finished, they took out their maths books and started working. After that, they did social studies, reading and spelling. When the playtime bell rang, the children put their books neatly in their desks, quietly lined up, and walked out of the room and down the stairs. "So, how's your supply teacher?" asked Lewis out on the playground. "Tough," said BB. "I've never worked so hard in my life." "I did more work before 10 o'clock than most people do in a day," said Calvin. "But he's very fair," Myron added quickly, just in case Mr. Gorf was listening. He might have been hiding in the bushes. "Yes, he's nice and fair and a very good teacher," said Jenny. "Very smart too," said Dee. "We're lucky to have him." Lewis twisted the end of his moustache between his fingers. After playtime, the children returned to class and worked until lunchtime. At lunch, they ate all the food Miss Mush served them. Their manners were perfect. Mr. Gorf might have been hiding under the table. After lunch, they returned to class and practiced their handwriting. Myron looked around. All of a sudden, he got a terrible urge to do something. Anything. "Ooga booga," he said. Jenny put her finger to her lips. "Biff, boff, boof," said Myron, a little louder. "Shh," said Jenny. Myron stood up. "No," he shouted. "I don't have to be quiet." Everyone tried to get Myron to hush up. Myron climbed on top of his desk. "Look around, folks. There's no teacher. We're doing all this work for nothing." "Get down," whispered Alison. "Do you want to get us all in trouble?" Myron jumped on top of Alison's desk. "Hi, Alison," he said. Then he hopped over to Deedee's desk, then Ron's, then Mauricia's. "Please, Myron," said Mauricia. "This is fun," said Myron. He made a great leap and landed on top of the teacher's desk. Mrs. Jules had always kept a tin full of lollipops on her desk. It was still there. "Hey, anyone want a lollipop?" asked Myron. Everyone stared at him. Myron took one for himself. He sat in the teacher's chair with his feet up on the teacher's desk and sucked on it. "Please stop, Myron," begged Jenny. "What if he's hiding in the cupboard?" "Oh, get real," said Myron. "Why would he hide in the coat cupboard?" "What if Mr. Gorf was married to Mrs. Gorf?" asked Alison. Myron laughed. "Who would ever want to marry Mrs. Gorf?" he asked. "Somebody had to marry her," said Rondi, "or else she wouldn't have been a Mrs." "What if he loved her very much?" asked Alison, "and then one day she didn't come home from work and he never saw her again and he didn't know what happened to her, but he knew she used to teach this class, so he might be hiding in the coat cupboard to try to find out if we're the ones who got rid of her." "If I was married to Mrs. Gorf," said Jason, "I'd be glad she never came home. He should thank us." "Oh, nice going, Jason," said Jenny. "If he is hiding in the cupboard, you just told him we're the ones who got rid of his wife." "Well, if I didn't, you just did," said Jason. "It doesn't matter," shouted Myron, "because Mr. Gorf is not hiding in the cupboard." Myron went to the back of the room and opened the cupboard door. A man stepped out. "Oh, thank you," he said. "I accidentally locked myself in here this morning, and I've been waiting for someone to open the door." Myron swallowed his lollipop, stick and all. Well, join me tomorrow for 2 more chapters. Goodbye.